I'm here today with Professor Ivor Samuels in Oxford at his home, and it's September 2019. So thank you very much for agreeing to do this interview. And my first question is, why and when did you decide to get into an architectural course?
Well, really, it started at school. In Britain, then and still now, you had to specialise in your last 2 years, and in fact could only do 3 or 4 subjects at the most. And I chose to do art because I enjoyed it and was quite good at it, and history and English. And at that time, art was, I suppose, not considered a respectable profession, whereas architecture was, and it was the direction, I guess, that many students who enjoyed art and were good at it were pushed. I had a very good art teacher, Michael Cox, who knew a lot about architecture and, in fact, encouraged me to go to the Architectural Association school, which is a very particular place in those days. It's considered the most avant-garde school. I also had a great history teacher, Dr. Friedman, who was a German refugee from the Nazis, and who, I suppose, aroused in me a great interest in history that I've continued with ever since.
How was the life of an architectural student at the Architectural Association back in the end of the 50s and beginning of the 60s?
Well, it was quite a shock for me arriving straight from school into the first year of the Architectural Association course, where we had our drawing boards in a row in the very big studios with about 50 or 60 of us in the first year. And I found myself next to, on my right, there was someone who'd been a fighter pilot. On my left, there's someone who'd been a midshipman in the Navy. And behind was someone who'd been a guards officer. And I'd come straight from school. And this happened because it was just at the time when conscription had finished. National service had finished. So some of my contemporaries in the school had done their national service, and others, like me, had come straight from school. And it wasn't the fashion at the time to do a gap year. So it was quite a shock. But it was quite an enlightened school, in the sense that the first year was an introductory year, very much a Bauhaus type of formulation. Whereas in the second, third and fourth year, we did projects for buildings based in context, first of all of the village, increasing in scale in the third year to the town, and in the final year to that of the city. So that was really quite, I suppose it was almost an introduction to beginning to think of buildings in a context rather than separate objects. We also had some very good teachers. Among them, I had Alan Cahoon and Robert Maxwell, who were both practicing architects and who also were very good teachers. And also we had Arthur Korn, and in the fifth year, the tropical department, which I did, there was Otto Königsberger, and both these had been refugees from Nazi Germany, again, I suppose, contemporaries of Conzen. So there's interesting links across here. I did the fifth year in architecture because I'd spent the fourth year working in an office in Israel, and I was very interested in architecture in a, I suppose, responding to its context. And I also was a bit concerned about the way architecture seemed to me to be somewhat of a fashionable activity. It changed its fashion. It's almost, I think it's got much worse now, where you could say it's a branch of the fashion industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really interested in the tropical department because it was an opportunity to learn something new, to really experience how you could respond to particular contexts of the tropics. So that's what I did in the fifth year, and I did my thesis project was housing in a new town in Israel. So I was interested in housing already by then. And I suppose it was an interest in housing as opposed to an interest in designing specific houses.
Mm-hmm.
Again, there's a sort of fashion in architecture for designing houses on cliff tops for sculptures or something special like that, rather than ordinary housing for ordinary people. So I was interested in making ordinary places already from them, although I don't think it was a very conscious awareness of this interest.
So then you get your first job at the London County Council, and again you had the opportunity to work with the program of housing. So how were these years at LCC?
Well, it was extraordinary. I came straight out of architecture school into town development division. Town development division was designing expanded towns. This was a successor to the New Towns program. And it became, we were designing housing, town centres, industrial estates in various towns around London where population was being moved out of London. Part of the Abercrombie plan, moving population out of London, building new towns beyond the Green Belt. And I came into a group which was working in Huntingdon, expanded town, and was asked to design a housing estate of 150, 200 houses, which was, just amazing for someone out of school to be given this job to do. It was quite intimidating in a way, but they gave it to me and told me to get on with it. I designed it, it's built. I used a Radburn layout because I guess it was the sort of thing one did at that time. I'm not sure I would do that now. I certainly wouldn't. But at the time, it seemed to work, and it was built like that. And the extraordinary thing is, about 20 years later, when I was doing work with the Civic Trust, I went into their office for a meeting, and one of the architects there had on her drawing board a plan of this estate. And he said, I recognize that. It's American Lane East that I designed. She said, yes, we're redesigning it. I don't think they actually did redesign it, but they were adding houses into it to make it more dense, more intense. The other interesting thing about that group, I also designed some factories in Andover, expanded town. But the interesting thing was, for later connections, was that the group leader was a Polish architect who'd been one of the people who'd come over with the Anders army during the war. And there were a couple of other Polish architects in that division at the time. And that's only interesting for later contacts, which we'll find out about.
Okay. You've mentioned that you prefer the program of ordinary housing to exceptional housing. When did you started changing your focus of interests from individual buildings to parts of towns and cities? Or in other words, when have you become a morphological believer?
Well, that's, I suppose it already started at the AA, that's why I chose to do housing as a thesis subject and not an individual building. But then going into the LCC, that also in, encouraged me in that direction, working on housing, being next to people working on town centres and in industrial estates rather than individual buildings. So I was in a milieu which was interested in that. And I suppose that that interest really was consolidated by spending a short time after the Architectural Association in a very large architectural firm called Architects Co-Partnership. At that time it was quite avant-garde, and I was in a team working on the new University of Essex. It was a very big team doing a little corner of a building, a very complicated special building, and I really didn't enjoy that very much. And that sort of consolidated my view and also encouraged me to think about doing town planning. I should say that while I was at the LCC, I met my wife, Olga Vitalia, she then was. She is an architect, graduated from Milan, who'd worked in Geneva and then found a job in the schools division of the London County Council Architects Department. And she was working on the building of the Regent Street Polytechnic, which is now the University of Westminster, a very prominent building opposite Madame Tussauds in Baker Street. And she always reminds me that I was on the 3rd floor and she was on the 6th floor of the building. It was an enormous architects department, about 600 architects. And of course, that's an interesting difference from now. At that time, the public sector architecture departments were considered to be avant-garde. It was the place you went to rather than one of the big star architects' offices. And that's a really interesting difference.
The mid-60s, you get to Edinburgh to master in town planning. Why did you decide to do this master, and how was your experience with the planning research unit at that university?
Well, I decided to do the masters because of my growing interest that we've discussed before in the context of buildings, and it seemed to me from experience in the London County Council that the decisions which really counted, which were really important, were being made by planners. Of course, later on, I realised that it's actually the politicians and the funders who make the important decisions, but I think that I wasn't really willing to go in that direction. But in Edinburgh, we had a course. We were mainly architects on the course at that time, doing the postgraduate masters. And the leader of the course was Percy Johnson Marshall, who had been one of the planners of Coventry, the rebuilding of Coventry after the war. As part of that course, I did a thesis on the neighbourhood unit in British New Towns and how it was evolving, which went from Ebenezer Howard and his diagram right up to, not yet to Milton Keynes, but to Washington Newtown. Milton Keynes, I think, was emerging at the time I was writing it. So that was another dimension to this broader aspect. I then, at the same time, or a little bit later, there was a growing concern about the role of the architect in planning, because the fathers of planning in Britain had been largely architects, Abercrombie and so on. But gradually they were being replaced by graduate planners, people coming out of planning courses, as planning established itself as a separate profession. I don't think this happened to the same extent in other countries.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's very interesting at the launch of your book in Birmingham, when I asked how many architects were there, there was myself and you and a colleague from Portugal, the only architects. The rest were geographers and town planners.
Mm-hmm.
So the gradual split from planning of architects. And there was a man called Anthony Goss who then wrote a report in 1973 called The Architect and Town Planning, which lamented this and proposed some changes in the course structures so as to bring them together. And really, in a way, that's how urban design emerged as a separate activity in this country. We'll come back to that a bit later when we come down to Oxford. The other thing that was interesting, that in working in Italy, in Milan, I'd become aware that there was a different approach to towns other than the townscape approach of Gordon Cullen. Mm-hmm. And of course we were brought up in that, on that in school and also in the town planning course. That was the way we looked at towns, through the lens of Gordon Cullen. Mm-hmm. And in fact, this was a time when Conson was already doing his work on Anik. But we were never aware of this. There was no connection. I don't think in the planning course, we ever had a talk from a geographer. Certainly, a geographer wasn't aware of the geographers weren't aware in Edinburgh, weren't aware of the Consonian mm-hmm. school and what was going on. However, in Italy, before I went to Edinburgh, I became aware there was another approach to looking at towns. And it wasn't very articulated at that time for me, and partly because I was in Milan, and the extraordinary difference between the different schools in mm-hmm. Italy. You know, Italy, I suppose, has existed for about 150 years, mm-hmm. and it was city-states before that, and the academic world at that time, and I suspect very much today, is still divided up into schools related to their locations. Mm-hmm. And none of the Milanese had heard of the Caniggian or Muratorian school. I hadn't actually, but I was aware that there was something going on. It was probably through Aldo Rossi and people like that I first became aware of another approach. But that's all, mm-hmm. you know, and certainly in the planning course we weren't made aware of it. And the extraordinary thing is that in 1968, some new legislation had been introduced in Britain for conservation areas, that is going beyond the conservation of individual buildings and recognising that some areas needed special protection and conservation. And 4 studies were commissioned at that time: Chichester, York, Chester, and one other that I've forgotten. It'll come back to me. And they were really quite large studies intended as models of how you should do it, how you should look at a conservation area. And they were all based very much, Bath was the other one with Buchanan. Eminent planners, not an architect planners, were writing these, but there was no mention at all of any approach, Consonian approach, mm-hmm. even though he was working at that time and publishing, which shows the great gaps between professions which existed at the time. And I guess that's one of the reasons for ISRF to emerge, to bridge that gap. So that was the, I suppose, the training in town planning. Then afterwards, I worked in the town planning the Planning Research Unit at the University of Edinburgh, where we were doing sub-regional plans for parts of Scotland. And that was a very interesting experience because my particular task there was looking at the different small towns in a sub-region of Scotland. First of all, Grangemouth Falkirk, which was to the east of Edinburgh, and then the central borders, an area south of Edinburgh, of small towns. And we used a technique which had been developed in Poland. So again, there's this another interesting connection with Poland. And we actually had a Polish planner who came over and worked with us, called Jurek Kozlowski from Krakow. And there's a Professor Malish who'd invented what is called threshold analysis. Basically, a very simple idea of identifying the thresholds that towns would cross as they expanded, and then putting a cost on these thresholds, and on that basis making decisions about where expansion should go. And this was a Polish technique brought over at the time of the Cold War, was going on quite hot, and the Scottish Development Department, which was a regional government agency, published a book on the threshold analysis manual, which was how to do threshold analysis using this technique imported from communist Poland at the height of the Cold War. So I think this was a really interesting experience. And I learnt a lot from that.
So in addition to this practice and research experiences in Edinburgh, you've started teaching, and these were your first teaching experiences, not only in Edinburgh, but also in Glasgow. Could you talk a bit about that?
Well, I was teaching on undergraduate planning courses. I was teaching actually in 3 places with gaps in between.
Okay.
So it's rather complicated. First of all, teaching at Heriot-Watt University. Professor Anthony Travis gave me a job there and put me in as first year master, which was quite interesting, and it was very much teaching undergraduate planners basic things, and they're not architects, so it was quite a different approach to learning about places and experiencing places. And I taught there for, I think, around 2 or 3 years. And then I got offered a job to go to Yugoslavia, and by Shanklin Cox. Shanklin Cox was one of the best-known consultant firms at that time. Graham Shanklin and Oliver Cox had been in the London County Council. They designed Hook, Newtown, which was quite an iconic project, and set up their own practice. And they were subcontracting to the United Nations Development Programme for the Upper Adriatic project of the United Nations. And again, this was run by a Polish planner. It's extraordinary that things come around. He was in charge of the whole project. And I was involved in 2 detailed plans on the Adriatic coast. One was for Šibenik-Srima, which is in the centre of the coast, and the other was for Rijeka in the north. And I suspect one reason I got this job was that I spoke Italian at the time, and these areas had been quite important Italian, not colonies, but communities, quite big Italian communities. For example, they still publish newspapers in Italian. And the older people there all spoke Italian, the younger didn't. And that was fascinating on many levels, because it was a completely different society of Yugoslavia. It was a time when Yugoslavia had split from the Soviet bloc, and was really almost threatened by invasion of the Russians, Hungary and Czechoslovakia had been. So it was in some ways a tense time, but the sort of communism that was evolving in Yugoslavia was really very interesting, self-management. And I was very impressed how the two institutes I worked in, the Institute of Zavodobenistički Amacija and the Zavodobenistički Rijeka, self-managed themselves. There were bosses, but the salary of the bosses was limited to a certain relation. So sociologically it was very important. And I suppose the thing that struck me most about it was the dominance of the economists. For example, at Šibenik Srima, we were designing a new tourist resort on the coast. And I think we had 8 hotels of 600 beds. Mm-hmm. And in order to take advantages of economies of scale, the economists in the team insisted we had a central kitchen for all these hotels. And the food would be transported to each of them in turn, which I found quite extraordinary, but that was really a great surprise. But it was very interesting. And in Rijeka, I was working on the centre. Rijeka is a very interesting place because it had been Fiume before the war and had a long history. Again, the interest in history comes out. Mm-hmm. A long history of being the main port for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then, so again, there's a connection which we'll come back to later on. We were making a plan for the centre, and the pressure at the time was to build a motorway along the waterfront, an elevated motorway along the waterfront, cutting off the city centre from the harbour and the sea. Because Genoa had done this, so they thought it was appropriate. I think this is one of the best things I ever done, was to stop them doing that. Mm-hmm. And we made arguments and demonstrated how they could build a motorway around the back of the town, which would be elevated part of the way, but so was the one along the waterfront. But that has been built and the waterfront has been saved. So that was really, I think, was one of the best things I did, having not built something. Then I came back to teaching for a while at Heriot Watt. And then I got invited to do another job in Colombia. Mm-hmm. Again, it was a different firm based in Glasgow. And we went to Cartagena de Indias, which was an old port on the coast. And the idea was to do a structure plan. Well, I'd had a short period in planning in Lothian region. Mm-hmm. Time working on the structure plan for Lothian region. Structure plans were very broad plans within which more detailed plans were made at the time. So I'd had some planning experience in Lothian region. And then went to Colombia, and we went out there, but it was in fact rather like a novel of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. You may know, sort of magic realism.
My favorite writer.
Yes?
Yeah.
Yes, because the project never started. We lived there for 11 months, and it was very interesting. The project never started. We kept on going backwards and forwards to try and sort things out, but the Colombian government never managed to do it with the UNDP. Mm-hmm. So we were sitting there, and I learned some Spanish. My daughters went to school in Spanish, which was very good for them. And Olga enjoyed herself living by the beach in Cartagena. But it was real Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Mm-hmm. I did some teaching in Bogota because we had friends who were teaching in the University de los Andes there. So I went a few times to Bogota and spent some time there doing some teaching. And I made some friends there who later on came over and studied in this country. Mm-hmm. So that was Colombia. Then went back and went to teach in Glasgow School of Art. Again, this was an undergraduate planning course. And I think I was beginning to realize that planning courses weren't, how can I say, design-based enough for my interests. And I really needed to move into something where the skills of the planner and the architect were combined, i.e. urban design. It's related to the whole issue that Goss had been writing about 5 or 6 years before, about the need to re-engage architects with town planning. Whilst in Glasgow, I set up a practice with an architecture colleague from Edinburgh, and we had the rather grand title of Planners and Architects Collaborative. There were 3 of us, myself, my colleague in Glasgow, and we had a young architect who, when we opened an office in the East End of Glasgow, there was a big project of urban renewal called GEAR, Glasgow Eastern Area Renewal. And these were the tenement blocks, the 19th, early 20th century tenement blocks, very much like the European apartments, not like English housing at all, because Scotland was very different, its urban tissue was very different. And these were being rehabilitated, and we were doing work on them, and also looking at the spaces around them, and the shared spaces internally. And that was a really interesting work. And obviously these were occupied, so you had to work with the inhabitants and engage them in what we were doing. And it's very interesting that it was almost all women who were interested in what we were doing and became engaged. The men couldn't be bothered. They were either watching football or drinking in pubs. It was the women who brought their children along to all the meetings we had. And that was really it was very interesting. And that really, I suppose, sparked my interest in the reuse of built fabric, which again happened later on. I'd had some experience already in Italy where we were looking at an old factory and converting that. But this was another connection with the existing built environment.
In 1980, you have become involved in another teaching experience. You came to Oxford and started teaching at the Joint Centre for Urban Design here at Oxford Brookes, and later becoming the chair of the centre. Every year, in different parts of the world, I keep meeting former students that keep referring you as one of the most notable teachers that they ever had. So why was this experience so significant to so many different people?
Well, I don't know if it was me or the centre, because I think it was a very special place. It was set up by someone called Simon Atkinson, who left not long after I came. And it was just doing urban design. And it was a rather special setup because it was staffed by architects, town planners, geographers, and landscape architects, which was really quite unusual for them all to be teaching together. And they were employed by the departments of architecture or the departments of planning. And of course, the managers, administrators didn't like that because, we were between 2 departments and we were able to play one off against the other. And it was messy. And I think it was one of the reasons we flourished, as well as having so many different backgrounds. So I think it's largely the climate and the experience of the place that the students were appreciating as much as any single one of the teachers there. At that time, it was Ian Bentley, Paul Moraine, Sue McGlynn and Alan Alcott who produced Responsive Environments. And at that time, it was a very important work. I think it came out in 1985. I think it's underestimated in many outside Britain. You know, you hardly ever get any reference to it in United States literature. And it has been translated into Chinese, I believe, but not in other languages. Well, it may have been. I think perhaps in Spanish they've done it. I may be wrong. But the Joint Centre was pretty unique at the time. And the other thing was, which I think is unique now, is that we were able to practice urban design at the time. And in fact, we set up a practice with Bentley, Hayward, Moraine and Samuels, BHMS. The most important thing we did early on was we won a housing competition for a developer in Reading, which actually got built. We had an executive architecture firm to build it. We couldn't cope with the building of it and do the teaching at the same time. But I think that was important because it was in a way of implementing the ideas of responsive environment, but also going back to streets and using streets. It's very interesting. It was published by Architects Journal, and they showed one or two of the other projects which went into the competition, and they were freestanding buildings, no streets connecting them. So that was the big difference. I think there are things we wouldn't do now, obviously. I think the rear court parking that we had was something we wouldn't do. But the whole road network and the way it integrated into the tissues of the town centre were really important. And we did a lot of other projects, for example, the Glasgow competition and so on. I suppose it would be quite difficult for people in teaching to do so much practice as we were able to do at that time. I think things have become much more specialized, to the extent where I believe that teaching is even more specialized. You have teachers who do research and teachers who teach. But then what happens in Portugal?
It's the same.
It's the same, because I've heard it happening here, and certainly in Poland it's happening as well, which I think is regrettable.
This relation between teaching and practice that you established here in Oxford also led to the commission of some plans, notably in France, for small towns such as Asnières-sur-Oise and Saint-Gervais-les-Bains, Menessy. These plans were, and they are still today, a reference for those who want to understand the linkage between urban morphology and planning practice. So looking back at these experiences, mainly in the 90s and end of the 80s, what do you think were the most important achievements? What do you think were the main difficulties? And what do you think are the main challenges that we still face today when trying to bridge the gap between the research that we do on urban forms and when we want to design new and adapt existing?
Well, I think I have to go a little bit back before I try to answer that rather difficult question. Among the staff of the Joint Centre, there was a geographer, Brian Goody, who'd studied in Birmingham. And also in the Joint Centre at that time, we had a lot of Latin American students from Mexico, and in particular one girl from Chile. And talking to them, I became aware that they knew much more about Italian urban morphology than I did, probably because of their linguistic facility. And I began to talk to them, engage with them. And in fact, one of the first things I ever wrote was with Maria Adriana Gabar, the Chilean architect, on a very naive view of what morphology was about, a little research note. And at the same time, Brian Goody, the geographer from Birmingham, said, "Oh, I know people in Birmingham who are doing things like that." And so that became the first connection with the geographers and the Konzinian school. And I think it was 82, there was this conference in Birmingham where I talked a bit about the Italians. And that was the first time it came together. And from then it's history. Now, parallel with that, that was really bringing the morphological approach in. Oh, and at the same, another thing that I must say is that my Italian connections had introduced me to Caniggia. And first of all, Paolo Moretto, who was the father of Marco Moretto, who had this amazing trip to Genoa. It was Genoa, there was a conference on Muratori, where Caniggia came, and I was invited to go. And I went with a colleague from Oxford, David Witham, and we went by train at that time. Went through Paris, down to the Riviera and across to Genoa. When we arrived about 11 o'clock at night, Paolo Moretto met us at the station and proceeded to take us on a tour of the Palazzi Genovesi, starting at 11 o'clock at night. And he wanted to show us the arrangements of the staircases. We were exhausted after the journey, but it's typical of his enthusiasm that he wanted to do this. And that's where I met Caniggia. And then Caniggia had a sabbatical and came to Oxford for about a month. And he talked to our students, and he was very excited about Oxford. He really was emphatic that Oxford was a Roman settlement, even though all our archaeologists said no. I think that's an argument that we've seen repeated in other places. And also we took him to Dorchester, which was a real Roman settlement. And he got really excited about scrubbing around in the fields and finding bits of Roman pottery. So that was the sort of morphological dimension. Now, the other dimension was the project dimension. I think that work based on projects was always very creative because it was exploratory. The staff and the students never knew what was going to come out at the end of it. And we did projects all in Britain mainly, but through Erasmus there was the opportunity to do projects in other locations. And in particular, it started off before Erasmus through someone called Vitor Oliveira, who's very well known for his vernacular architecture work, who was a teacher both at the AA and in Oxford Polytechnic, Oxford Brookes, who had a contact in France, a lady who ran a patrimoine historique et artistique de la France, who proposed we do some projects, and we did one in a town called Donzenac, and they were small towns where we would go with a group of students, and then we would be lodged chez les habitants, and we would work on the project and then present it at the end of 2 weeks. And we did 2 or 3 of those. And then one of these was in Agnières-sur-Oise. And the mayor of Agnières-sur-Oise liked our approach so much that he invited us to do the plan d'occupation des sols, the POS for the town. The problem was that the POS was already being prepared by a French architect. So I had to explain before the Conseil Communal what our approach was and why they should take it away from the French architect. and give it to a group of British architects. And you can imagine that was not a... But the mayor was a pretty powerful lawyer, and through him we got the job to do this. Now, the other connection between Birmingham and Oxford was through our students. There were two students, Anthony Hall and Carl Kropp, who were our students in Oxford in the JCUD and then went to Birmingham to do PhDs. So that was another connection. At that time, Carl Kropp was doing his PhD in Birmingham, and he used Agnès-sur-Oise as the field study for his PhD. So it's really interesting, this connection between Birmingham and Oxford, between field projects and academic work. And at the same time, Olga, who was by then teaching first year and giving some lectures on conservation because she'd done a master's on conservation while we were living in Edinburgh, was running the Erasmus program. And she had organized a lot of contacts between French, Spanish, Danish, and I think that was British universities, schools of architecture. And we did a series of projects in France and in Spain on waterfronts. And they were very interesting because very interesting both as projects, but also to observe the different relationships between staff and students coming from the different schools. The Agnès-sur-Oise project was very important, both as an example of the application of a morphological approach to planning, but also because it won a prize, the Prix d'Innovation of the notaries, French notaries, and it encouraged the mayor of Agnès-sur-Oise to set up a firm to do plans for small towns in other parts of France. He set up a firm called, first of all, called Calipos, the poste qualitative, rather than quantitative. And then he was called Droit de Cité after. And he used his network of lawyers and notaries who were mayors in a lot of these communes. And France is amazing. It's 37,000 communes, each of which can make its own plan. I think it's changed now, but at that time it certainly was the case. So these plans were, he set up an office in Paris, he employed some young architects, and we had not an important role, but it was a wonderful opportunity to visit different parts of France, all of which produce wine, of course, and cheeses. We did those. And Olga was very important in these because she'd worked as an architect in Geneva and her French was fluent, much better than mine. And then I think the problem was that the mayor of Agnès-sur-Oise got kicked out not long after we'd done the plan, and the whole plan was abandoned. And we had a student, a French student, Laurence Paticini, who now teaches in Sheffield, who did her master's on investigating just that. And I think that this is a very important thing, which we don't do enough, often enough, is looking back and seeing what happens to things. I know architects don't like doing it. I came an extraordinary thing. I was doing some work, and I came across this project for a prize-winning library in Germany, where the architects were publishing photographs before any of the books were put in the library. And someone told me that architects, in fact, have contracts where they have permission to photograph the building before it's occupied. It seems to me a direct contradiction. I don't think we do enough of this evaluating what happened. For example, there's the Bologna plan, which Cervellati, which is an extraordinary piece of work. I know that some work has been done on that, but I've never seen it extensively published.
Mhm.
And so I think there's an enormous field where it's going back and looking at things. Now, I think the Anier plan was dropped because it was just too complex for the professionals who had to implement it. They weren't local professionals from the commune, which wasn't big enough. It was from the department. And they were not in sympathy with the approach particularly and just found it too complex. So the whole thing was dumped. And I think this is a danger in consultancy work, where you come in, you do a wonderful plan, and then someone else takes it over to implement it. So you have to be aware. I don't know whether from your experience in Portugal, you've come across similar circumstances.
It's very similar.
Yeah.
There is a huge gap between plan preparation and plan implementation.
Yeah.
Different teams do different
Yeah.
parts of
I
the
mean,
process.
I think this is a big challenge for us, and it's part of this gap.
Yeah.
You know, mind the gap again between practice and the academy, which will something we come back to.
So today, the International Seminar on Urban Form is the most important international organization devoted to the study of urban form. ISUF was created in 1994, but before that, a decade before, or more than a decade, there were a lot of contacts to enable this event to happen in 1994. You have already mentioned the previous contacts with Birmingham, and the contacts with Italian colleagues like Anidia and Mareto. So could you describe us a bit more about this long but very solid process that happened?
Well, I think we have to bring in Anne Vanet-Moudon, because I think she was and still is a very important figure in ISUF. I don't know whether it was immediately before or after Caniggia was in Oxford that he went to Seattle. And then a bit afterwards, Anne invited me to Seattle. So we began to establish this relationship and interest. And of course, Anne from Lausanne had this connection to the whole Francophone world. And I think these were very important. And in fact, I suppose it came in together in Lausanne. And she, of course, was the first president. And I've always admired her because she has made morphology accessible in her writings. It isn't the mystique that it can be, or the obscure discipline that sometimes it comes out to be. I think it was one of Jeremy's students who said that the word urban morphology immediately arouses panic in people. Just the word morphology. It's a long, difficult word. And I think she's been very important in making it accessible. I have not really been too close to the mechanics of ISUF evolving. Jeremy Whitehand and Kaigu and other people who have been very important in that.
The 90s, you've started a very interesting experience with Sue McGlynn. Instead of teaching students or even practitioners, you've started teaching developers, which are another main agent of change. So how did this happen, and how were these courses, workshops organized?
Well, I suppose it happened through our doing projects for and with developers. For example, the Reading project was built with through a developer. It was chosen by a developer and local authority. And the developers, I suppose they found potential value in what we had to offer. And they encouraged us to come along and talk to their teams in very simple, accessible ways. And we did it with a couple of developers. And again, it was necessary to be able to convey our ideas and our approaches in an accessible manner, which was relevant to their interests. Again, I think this is always adjusting the message to the audience, just as dealing with inhabitants of a small town. You have to adjust it, and you have to have methods. In fact, around the same time, I was doing things with the Civic Trust regeneration unit. We were looking at small market towns in Britain. And again, one of my former students, a former student from Glasgow actually, who was very active in the Civic Trust at that time. Civic Trust is an NGO, national, operating nationally. And it had a regeneration unit which doesn't exist anymore. But we had funding from the Countryside Commission to do small town work. And he set up exercises in these towns, which he called the good, the bad, and the ugly. Do you remember the film?
Yeah.
The spaghetti western.
Yes, Sergio Leone.
That's right. And, you know, I think it was a brilliant move to entitle them those, because they got people in and we had meetings and people wrote on notes what they thought was good about the place, what they thought was bad about the place, what they thought was ugly. I mean, obviously there are overlaps, but I don't think that mattered, and the advantage of the title overcame that. And we would analyze these and use them. And the interesting thing about these projects was the way we worked with social and economic consultants very closely, who joined in the good, the bad, and the ugly, because they went across not just the physical form of cities, but also other aspects, the social aspect, the economic aspects of these towns. So we crossed over and integrated. And our work as urban designers really was only part of the whole project. And that seemed to go very well. So it was really taking the message to developers, to house builders in particular. And this was at a time when house builders were being encouraged to improve the quality of their product. And CABE, Commission for Architecture and Built Environment, introduced a program called Building for Life, where they had a number of criteria, which incidentally were devised by members of the Civic Trust and then implemented by CABE, where projects were evaluated, both built projects and proposed projects, and we were given awards, annual awards. And we had very simple criteria for doing this. And I became an enabler on this. In fact, it was after I'd stopped teaching in the Joint Centre that I did most of it, after about 2001. And it was amazing. I evaluated about 60 schemes, which gave me great insight into the problems of housing. And I became a super enabler, so I was checking other enablers or tours doing it, which was very interesting. At the same time, I was part of the CABE think tank on what they call strategic urban design, called STRUD, which is an ugly word, and I think they didn't like it, so they changed it to large-scale urban design. And all this is now in the National Archive, because CABE is doing much less than it did. And that was interesting because it was looking beyond the detail design at bigger things. And that has become, for me, even more relevant in the recent work.
In 1985, you have been involved, you have contributed to some important books and translations of books. First in 1985 with Pierre Morland in the Morphologie urbaine et parcellaire. Then in 1990 in Terry Slater's book on the built form of Western cities, and more recently after coming out of the Joint Center, you have produced the English translation of a notable French book, Forme urbaine de l'îlot à la barre, by Jean Castex, Philippe Henry, and Jean-Charles de Paul. How would you look back to all these three experiences?
Well, I'm sure that compared with many academics in the field of morphology, there are relatively few books, because I think there were many more publications I was involved in which were connected with projects I was doing, some of them published by governments, others by international agencies. Those books that you mentioned, the French one, was really the product of a remarkable conference at Arc-et-Senon, the Ledoux Saltworks, which was an extraordinary place to have a conference. And I think Bill Hillier was one of the other contributors, but I think probably I was one of the few British contributors. And interestingly enough, there wasn't anyone from the Canadian Moratorian School contributing, although they are cited in the index. Sorry, in the bibliography. There isn't an index. Like many French academic books, it doesn't have an index, which I find extremely irritating. I don't know whether you come across this problem as well. The Slater book was also quite special because it was the chapter I contributed. I believe I was the only architect in the book, in 19 chapters. I was the only architect, last in the book, which perhaps is an indication of the status of architects in the geographical world. And it was an opportunity to write up some work I'd done in Venice. I'd got a scholarship from the Delmas Foundation to do some work in Venice. And I made contact with the Commune of Venice and the planners there, who'd done these extraordinary projects for parts of Venice, very detailed surveys of Venice and very detailed proposals. I mean, I just don't understand how they were able to do this, and I suspect a lot of it may have been done through student labour. Otherwise it would be impossible. I know Paolo Moreto did a lot of his work through student labour. But the other thing about this, which was very interesting, but I was never able to find out how much was actually happened as a result of these plans. It brings us back to this topic I mentioned earlier, following up work and finding out what actually happened as a result. The L'îlot à la barre, I should say Olga did most of the translation work on it. I just corrected her English a bit. And I added a couple of chapters because it took 25 years for it to get translated into English, which is incredible. Such a book with such a wide ranging field of operation from the garden cities to the Parisian urban bloc, to the Unité d'Habitation, all of international relevance translated into Italian and Serbian, Serbo-Croat, I think, at the time, but never into English. Quite extraordinary, and shows the Anglophone myopia, which has been written up quite often in urban morphology journal. So we thought it was time to do that. But of course, looking at it 25 years later, we realized the world had changed, and the street had come back. The ELO had come back, in fact. So that's why we put in things, a couple of new chapters relating to the new urbanists and work being done in Britain, in particular Poundbury, which was coming back to where the original de l'Îlot à la Barre had started. And I only had contact really with Philippe Penneray for the book, and he was very agreeable for it to be translated, but also modified. In fact, the publishers would only publish it in English if we added some chapters. And that's really interesting. They wouldn't leave it just like that. So that was quite important, and that was done after I left the Joint Centre. It was one of the things I was doing. I left the Joint Centre in 2002, something like that. And I did some teaching in the United States, in California, which was very interesting. And also quite a lot of work for CABE and the Civic Trust and other consultancy work. Also, I suppose it's a time when the Urban Morphology Research Group attracted me to become a member, because it gave me an academic base in Britain, which I didn't have at the time, and that's been very, very positive for me, very important.
In 2012, the then president of ISOF, Michael Conzen, has invited you to coordinate a task force on research and practice, a topic that, as we have seen in this interview, has always been present in your life. The task force has extensively debated the theme. It has produced a report, and some of the recommendations that were in the report were in fact developed by some ISOF members over the last years. What do you think you can add more to this topic of the relation between research and practice? How do you see it today?
Well, I think in some ways it's getting even more difficult as people are becoming more specialized, and academics, with the incentive to keep on publishing and achieve research scores, seem to be becoming even more esoteric in their work. I suppose that one of the fundamental keys still is that the teaching in planning and architecture courses of urban morphology is basic to this, to give the students who are emerging into practice a grounding in these topics and an understanding of how they might use them in their practice. And I wonder if there are models in other professions which we can't use. For example, in medicine, I wonder if the gap between practice and research in medicine is as wide. I don't know enough about it, but it might be worth someone examining this, someone who knows about it, perhaps reporting on this, because I have the impression that there are medics in the field of surgery or specializations who both practice and that they go to investigate patients and see patients, but also doing research and teaching in it. So I wonder if there's a model there, because I suspect very little practice is done in academic circles now, as we were able to do in the Joint Centre, which was really very important, both for the from the point of view of developing techniques and putting ideas into implementation, but also as a teaching tool, as an exploration for students. I found that quite difficult in the United States teaching, where students expected me to tell them the outcome at the beginning of the project, because they wanted to know what they had to do in order to achieve a good grade. Whereas for us at the time, the project was always an exploration, and we never knew quite what exactly the output would be. So I think that's something which would be great to do. And some of the teaching that has been done in urban morphology in different institutions has been published in urban morphology. I think the Spanish have done it quite a lot. And a lot of it is available on American websites of universities. I remember I looked at the time, very little was being done there. It was very difficult, for example, to find what was being done in Britain. So these degrees of secrecy and openness of different societies really emerge in things like that. And again, I suppose there is the question of the professions involved in urban morphology. Again, we've referred to the book launch where there are so few architects, but I guess there are many more architects and people involved in planning, involved in morphology in other contexts than Britain. So there's no easy answer. I'm sorry I haven't given you one.
So you have already mentioned that after Oxford Brookes, you have continued some teaching experiences. You've mentioned California. In 2015, you've started a new one in Krakow with Anna Agata Kantarek. This collaboration then led to the development of a research project on post-socialist urban form that got funded by ISUF. Could you talk us a bit more about the teaching experience at Krakow and the project?
Well, I found the teaching experience remarkably rewarding, probably because I hadn't done it for a while, and coming back and finding these students who were enthusiastic and whose English was as good as my British students. It really was remarkable. So there must be very good traditions of language teaching in both Poland and Serbia later on, where I was involved, not to the same extent. And it's very interesting going to this society which had changed so much, and going into an open market society. And it really emphasized for me the importance of land ownership in the whole business of making plans, town planning, urban form, which we'd hardly talked about. You know, when I did my undergraduate architecture, no one ever mentioned urban land ownership. In planning, we never mentioned it. The work I did in the London County Council never mentioned it because, the land was just there and you designed on it. And it was only much later that we became aware of it, and I became aware of it in the Joint Centre. And something, going back to the Joint Centre, that's worth mentioning is that Ian Bentley had been a property developer at one time. So all our students had to do feasibility studies of their projects. So, they were quite simple feasibility studies, but they had to think about that aspect of how much the land cost, how much they could sell the things for, and how much profit they would make, and so on, which very rarely happens, I think, in academic courses. And I transferred that to Poland, and the students loved it. They really enjoyed doing that so much, trying to make the most profit. I don't know whether that was because, well, it's almost a generation since the regime change, but it went down very well in Poland, that sort of exercise. And also, other exercises I transferred to Poland were the whole business of tissues, using tissues for design. So that was really very successful. As for our own work in Krakow, that was our research, in quotation marks. For me, it was a very interesting discovery of the new town of Nowa Huta, which had been built in the late 1950s, 60s, next to Krakow, with apparently urban blocks. And in one of the works we did, we quoted Elizabeth Plater-Zybert, the urbanist, who'd come over and said, "You've got this wonderful example which has streets." But if you look at it, the streets don't have doors, and it's all about control. And very interesting. And Agatha had actually lived in Nowa Huta. She was at school, and she said that they'd paraded down these big boulevards on May Day and so on. That's what they were beautiful. So from that point of view, it was very interesting, and it made the connection also with other, with blocks without streets without doors, which were an urban form which has really been neglected. If we look at the Viennese Karl Marxhof and that Viennese housing program, they're the same. So it's all about control. And then I discovered that in Oxford we have these streets which actually look like streets, and they have doors in them, but the doors don't actually open because they're entered from the back. So there's a sort of interesting linkage there of control and land ownership. But of course, in the socialist housing, the land ownership was all state-owned land. And coming back to the market and privatization, the Polish experience is extraordinary. The mosaic of land ownerships that you get now in Poland is quite extraordinary. It makes it very difficult to do any proper, any comprehensive planning. Although there is building control in Poland, there isn't the same extent of control in Serbia. And our project compared Poland and Serbia. And this idea that as you move from the centre, you get less and less like everywhere else. So the centre has shopping centres like we do here in Oxford, the same horrible shopping centres with blank walls. Krakow has them, Belgrade, not to the same extent, they're much better. But as you move out to the edge of the town, the pattern and the form changes dramatically. Because in Britain we have this powerful instrument of the Green Belt, which is politically untouchable. It doesn't matter what government. And that has constrained the way towns grow. And it also goes hand in hand with land ownership. It's the very special pattern we have in Britain of very large landowners, which has existed from the 18th century. And if you fly over Britain, you see the landscape looks very different from, say, flying over Poland, with the strip agriculture. It's interesting, there's one exhibition on Mons Nyashmolian saying one village in Britain which still has that strip agriculture system, which it didn't get enclosed for some reason. And it looks just like the Polish landscape. So you have all these strips which are now being built on separately, which creates great problems of servicing, problems of access dependent on the car. But on the other hand, it gives the freedom of people to build their own houses. And it was very interesting. I was at a conference in Plymouth recently, and we took the opportunity to visit Poundbury again after a long time. And for the first time, I read the conditions imposed on people who buy houses in Poundbury. And they say that in order to change any colour on the front of your house, door or window, you have to get permission of His Highness the Prince of Wales. That seems to me to be as much control as the communists had over the Nova Huta new town. So I wonder if there isn't some virtue in this plot my plot urbanism. If we can achieve a sort of strategic urban design, which is not so worried about the details of the building, but more about the strategy, the organization of plots. And it doesn't work in Poland. We've published something in the Viewpoint in Urban Mythology on this, you may be aware of. It doesn't work, and enormous inefficiencies on putting in roads. But I also have recently discovered that in Indian cities, Ahmedabad, where there are a lot of small owners on the edge, they have a program of reorganizing plots so that no one loses, but you have a better organization of plot to build your own house in. And I wonder if that isn't the future, which is an interesting lesson to come out of having worked in Krakow and in Belgrade. And of course, it's very interesting for me to go to work in Poland again after the connections we had. My first job, Polish architects, the threshold analysis in Edinburgh, and now Krakow, and then go back to what was Yugoslavia and work in Serbia. And there's another personal connection, which is that my mother was born in Poland and left when she was less than a year old. They were refugees. They escaped Poland and came to Britain. But it wasn't Poland then. It was part of Russia. And so there's this very interesting experience of going back to a place that my grandparents fled, left, and going back and having a very warm welcome there and enjoying being there. So that's a sort of very nice closing of one circle.
It was a pleasure to have this interview. Thank you very much for agreeing doing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Vitor, for taking the trouble to come and do it and make me think about these things.
Thanks.